So, welcome to the last lecture for CLT. So, I'm away at a conference, hence this is pre-recorded, and it's just going to be on Derrida's University Without Condition, with some mention of assessment later on as well. So, in a way, it makes me quite sad to talk about this lecture, largely because it's the end of the module, although that shouldn't really mean the end of CLT. In fact, it's only really the beginning, but also because whatever Derrida is talking about in his article, The University Without Condition, we have already betrayed. So a lecture in two parts. The first part is just on the unconditional and impossible, and that's going to treat specifically with his article, and the second part I'm going to talk a little bit about or against assessment. Okay, so the unconditional impossible, we've obviously come across a variety of Derrida's work by now, and you know that he's concerned with an ethics of the impossible, and this ethics of the impossible is something that Derrida returns to again and again. You have it in The Force of Law, for those of you who've read that, this idea of justice as going beyond the law, that the idea of justice is itself impossible. We've also talked, again, the concept about hospitality, the fact that hospitality should be unconditional and is at the same time impossible, the difference between hospitality and tolerance, because tolerance always comes with a limit beyond which you cannot go. It's about turning up at the doorstep and asking a question and wanting the other to respond in a certain way in order to be let into your house. Well, hospitality is about addressing the other, but about listening to the other, also thinking back to Spivak, about listening to the silence, that you can't compel folk to speak and to let them into your house nonetheless, regardless of whether they answer or not. So you've also got it in The Animal That Therefore I Am Following, which we looked at as well. You've got it on page, well, I've got different page numbers, but it's on page 396 in the full article, which you can access through Star Plus. It's in a journal called Critical Inquiry, which is awesome. But he talks about this idea of the impossible in The Animal That Therefore I Am as well. Being able to suffer is no longer a power, it is a possibility without power, a possibility of the impossible. So you've got the same kind of ethics of the impossible at work there. So what Derrida imagines, however, in this article, The University Without Condition, is this idea of a new humanities, and as always you have this word humanities in quotation marks to kind of question the usage of that word and to rip it out of its context a little bit, because also on the back of reading The Animal That Therefore I Am, this idea of the human, this myth of the human, is itself something that needs to be questioned and deconstructed. So the new humanities, as he writes, is about this unconditional freedom to question, and it's about unconditional resistance, and it has to do, as he writes in the article, to do with human rights, bearing in mind that that concept itself is to be deconstructed. And if you're interested in that, Alistair Hunt wrote a brilliant article about human rights and rightlessness, and you could also refer to Hannah Arendt, who obviously wrote about human rights and what the concept of human rights, or who the concept of human rights excludes. But so the university, in Derrida's view, is a space of unconditional discussion, but this space of unconditional discussion is not about enclosing itself there, and we're going to return a little bit to this idea between inside and outside as well, and that itself is a sort of space to be deconstructed. So the university without conditions does not in fact exist, as we know only too well. Nevertheless, in principle and in conformity with its declared vocation, its professed essence, it should remain an ultimate place of critical resistance and more than critical to all the powers of dogmatic and unjust appropriation. So hence why I'm sad, or maybe I also should say enraged, and sometimes driven by a blinding rage that barely keeps at bay a deep despair, is that because all of this we have betrayed. The university should be about the space of unconditional discussion, and it's about the right to deconstruction, it's about the right to ask critical questions. It's about and thinking about what sort of questions I or we are asking, and why, and what will these questions do to the other, because remember that Derrida is always concerned about trying to figure out how to live or how to be in a world of lesser violence. So humanities as deconstruction then, which begins here, now, always and interminably, so hence CLT really isn't over, it's only just beginning. And the humanities as deconstruction is something that Derrida sees as opposed to state powers, opposed to capital, economic powers, the powers of media, ideology, religion, etc. And it is a sort of cosmopolitan and universal, and it extends beyond worldwide citizenship and the nation state. In general, all of these obviously concepts, the nation state, etc., to be deconstructed, and if you remember what Theresa May said in her speech earlier this year, a citizen of the world is a citizen of nowhere. Well then, I think we need to pledge to be citizens of nowhere, even though that in itself comes with an inordinate amount of privilege, being issued with a passport from either the UK or the EU. However, the humanities then is something that does not stop at limits, so it's something that is properly transgressal, which is again something that Derrida also talks about in The Animal That Therefore I Am. He's interested in what he calls limitrophy, and that's his subject. He's talking about, and he's concerned with not just because it will concern what sprouts or grows at the limit, around the limit, but by maintaining the limit, but also what feeds the limit, generates it, raises it, and complicates it. That's what he's concerned about in everything in his work. He's about complicating limits, and these theses of limits and the ruptures and abysses that happen between one category, one binary opposition, and another. It's about dismantling all of that. And in a way, it is about obligations that we have to the living in general and everywhere, which is this kind of worldwide citizenship, which if you have a look at the Sheffield graduate, that's also something that you graduating from this university should be this sort of global citizen, which, as I said, in the current climate and according to Theresa May, means that you're a citizen of nowhere, but as I said earlier as well, with your rights not stripped at all, because of the privilege that we still have. Okay, but this new humanities and the university in general, where this new humanities occurs, this is also a space that Derrida conceives of as being supremely vulnerable. So if this unconditionality in principle and de jure constitutes the invincible force of the university, it has never been in effect. By reason of this abstract and hyperbolic invincibility, by reason of its very impossibility, this unconditionality exposes as well the weakness or vulnerability of the university. It exhibits its impotence, the fragility of its defences against all the powers that command it, besiege it, and attempt to appropriate it, because it is a stranger to power, because it is heterogeneous with the principle of power. The university is also without power of its own. So in a way, this also returns us to the beginning of the animal, that therefore I am to be naked in front of the other. That's where our thinking begins, and that's also where ethics begins, and that's where the sort of strange, paradoxical power of the university begins. At once a sort of invincible force, but this that still means that it is without power of its own, because it is a sort of force of dissidence. That's what Derrida imagines in a sort of utopian imagination. It is against power, and hence has none of its own, and nonetheless kind of functions as an invincible force against state power and a nation state, or at least in a sort of the imagination of the impossible, because that's kind of how Derrida understands utopia as well. One of the things then that he thinks about in the article as well, and that prompts his thinking about the university and the space of the university as an unconditional space of discussion and unlimited critical thinking, is this idea of sovereignty as well. And he talks about it as a particular form of sovereignty, and this particular form of sovereignty and the concept of sovereignty is itself always in deconstruction, and the sovereignty that he attributes to the university is that kind of force of dissidence. It's a force, going back to what he talks about in the force of law, it's allied with justice and with civil disobedience. Assuming that it has never been possible to identify an inside of the university that is a proper essence of the sovereign university, so he's kind of saying that kind of idea of sovereignty, that kind of idea of an invulnerable interior, is itself something to be deconstructed, and it's something that doesn't exist, which also means, as he writes, that the university, because of its fragility and vulnerability, often gives itself up. So this kind of there's a threat to this interior of the university, which is never kind of secured, but is always sort of threatened itself. And he talks about that on page 220 in The University Without Condition, where he talks about, and yet I maintain that the idea of the space of the academic type has to be symbolically protected by a kind of absolute immunity, as if its interior were inviolable. So you kind of have to believe in it to a certain extent, but there's also this little word as if, which Derrida spends some time on deconstructing as well. So there's this, but at the same time he's also saying if you have this kind of absolute immunity, there's always the threat of what he calls the dangerous processes of autoimmunity, e.g. so once the system starts to attack itself. If you're interested in that, you can also look at his interview that he did in a book called Philosophy in a Time of Terror, where he talks at length about this idea of autoimmunity, about when the system starts attacking itself. This is especially evident when you have a closed system. The energies that are expended in the centre of the system have nowhere to go but back inside. But anyway, so it is a concept, this concept of sovereignty and this inviolable interior is deconstructed and weirdly preserved at the same time. This is obviously something that Derrida does a lot of the time. You can think about it as that, what we talked about in words being under erasure as well. And anyway, this kind of interior has to always be kind of feeling its limit, as it were, to kind of return back to what Derrida says about limits in the animal, that therefore I am. On page 236 in The University Without Condition, he talks about one touches the very limit between the inside and outside, notably the border of the university itself and within it of the humanities. So one thinks in the humanities the irreducibility of their outside and of their future. One thinks in the humanities that one cannot and must not let oneself be enclosed within the inside of the humanities. So it's always about like being and occupying that sort of position at the limit between inside and out, with a great Scottish word which I think encapsulates that sentiment perfectly. So this little word as if then that Derrida spends some time on, which is about dreaming out loud and about engaging in a profession of faith. So an engagement, a commitment that you do publicly. To devote oneself publicly, to give oneself over to philosophy, to bear witness, this is a typo, or even to fight for it. So this is what Derrida sees as deconstruction as well, to devote yourself publicly and to give yourself over to philosophy. Again, you have this concept of vulnerability, of being naked in front of philosophy, philosophy as a sort of event, philosophy as coming from the other, that you need to sort of almost passively, there's a sort of passivity involved in that you are vulnerable in front of. So this as if should not signal either toward the utopia or the improbable future of a science fiction, or toward the dream of an immemorial or mythological past in illo tempore. So it's not about like this kind of, it's not about like conceiving of utopias or static, paradisical end point, but it's utopia in terms of this impossible movement, this endless questioning, endless critical questioning. And deconstruction is always concerned with the greatest possible justice that we can achieve. So this as if in Derrida's work is also about putting the present to the test, and you can see references to Freud here, to what he calls reality testing in Mourning and Melancholia, which is again something that I highly recommend. It's when the ego tests whether the object of love is really gone or not, and this as if sort of functions in a sort of similar way, in that it's questioning the present, it's a sort of movement against the present, against the status quo. Okay, as if and it is kind of, we're kind of talking about assessment a little bit now, but this as if is kind of putting the present to the test. But in this case, as I said, I'm just very much aware of the fact that I'm speaking from a position where the university has put itself up for sale, where it has been occupied by capital, it has been bought, and it has been taken over. And I think the logic of assessment is part of that. The logic of assessment is part of us not trusting you, and of like the assessment as part of us, of an audit culture. If you're interested in reading up on that, you should read Marilyn Strathern, The Tyranny of Transparency, which is also not just about assessment, but endless performance reviews that staff also have to undergo, like exercises like the REF, the Research Excellent Framework, and the Looming TEF, the Teaching Excellent Frameworks, all these measures that really indicate a lack of trust. You have to constantly demonstrate that you're doing your work, and you're doing your work in a specific way, not in a sort of force of dissidence, the way that Derrida imagines the university to functions, but actually in the spirit of absolute and total compliance. The logic of assessment is about that too: normalization, institutionalization, and systemization. And Thomas Speedmone wrote, actually in the 90s already, the late 90s, wrote a brilliant article called Radical Pedagogy and the Logic of Assessment, which you can access online. And he argues that the logic of assessments creates patterns of behaviour suited to a market-driven economy, e.g. students geared up for careers in middle management. But we will have to talk a little bit about assessment nonetheless. I like the assessment questions, and I really like seeing what you write, and the course team is always really excited about what happens in the essays, but it's just that the logic of assessment is nonetheless something that still exists, and we have to think of ways somehow around it, and there might be possibilities to do that in the near future, and I'll be in touch about that. But I guess a good way to think about essays is to think about pleasure, to think about the pleasures of thinking about critical theory and the pleasures of writing about that. And what I would say is that you have to keep your primary text in mind always, and always return to that. So while we encourage you to take conceptual leaps, there has to be a foothold from which to jump from. So this is something that Derrida talks about in the University Without Condition. You have to get a foothold in preparation for a leap, and that foothold is the attention, the careful attention that you pay to your text, to your theory that you're working with. So there's the stuff on Moule under the assessment guidelines that you should return to in terms of preparing your essay, and I'll send out an email as well after the feedback for the last assessment has been sent out. But those are the things to kind of bear in mind. People always have problems with introductions and conclusions. Be precise and be well, I guess if you read articles whose work the articles by people whose work you like, just pay attention to the way that they talk about that, how they begin their articles, how they end them. So it's a good point to start with a quotation from either a primary or secondary text, because it gives you something concrete to start from, and then move out a little bit to kind of consider what your argument is going to do. But remember about having a foothold in preparation for a leap. As a sort of final thought, I also would like to direct you to a brilliant piece by George Yancey, I'm a Dangerous Professor, just came out New York Times earlier last month, and CLT, I think, is about refusing adjustment. To be philosophically adjusted is to belie what I see as one major aim of philosophy, to speak to the multiple ways in which we suffer, to be a voice through which suffering might speak and be heard, and to offer a gift to my students that will leave them maladjusted and profoundly unhappy with the world as it is. I want them to engage in the process of freeing ideas, freeing their philosophical imaginations. I want them to lose sleep over the pain and suffering of so many lives that many of us deem disposable. I want them to become conceptually unhinged, to leave my classes discontented and maladjusted. So in a way, I hope that that's what CLT has done and is continuing to do, and I think it sums up a lot of what we've talked about across this term. So leave you with that then, but obviously that doesn't mean that this stops. We're just beginning, and we have to bear in mind that there's lots of work that remains to be done.